Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to you. It's a great crowd, too. Thanks for coming out. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, terrific. Well, it's good to be back in North Carolina. I'm a graduate of Wake Forest University, actually. Don't hold that against me. But from the class of 98, so it's always nice to be back here on what feels like home territory. These days in Washington, it's not a bad reason just to get out of town whenever you can. So it's nice to come down here and spend some time with you all. What I want to talk today about is the subject that I've been kind of both obsessed with as a journalist and focused on most intensely as an author for the past several years, and that is this emerging area of cyber warfare and cyber espionage. In the introduction was mentioned of how I'm going to talk about how cyberspace became seen as a battlefield. Which is an interesting way of conceiving of the internet. It's actually not one that I conceived of. It's actually something that the military and the intelligence community have been very focused on for the past several years, is beginning to see the internet as an operational space, both for spying on our adversaries and also for, in some cases, preparing to do battle with them in the physical realm. And the way that the military has talked about this, I think it's a very useful frame, is they refer to cyberspace as the fifth domain of warfare. Which you might ask, what are the other four domains? That would be air, space, sea, and the land. And the interesting thing about cyberspace, the military likes to say, is that the fifth domain is the only one in which the United States does not reign supreme as a force. There is not really a land army that can contest us. We have the most far-reaching naval force in the world. There is not an air force that can go toe-to-toe with us in a really credible way. And in space, which is not necessarily a military domain, but it is sort of a domain for espionage, we have some of the most sophisticated assets that are there. But cyberspace, that is not the case. We are challenged by a variety of nation-state actors, criminal groups, and various non-state threats that have really tested the resolve both of our military and our intelligence capacity. Today, it is safe to say, I think, that those threats, the military and the intelligence community would say, are top of mind as national security concerns, more so than a traditional military conflict with a nation like Russia or China. In fact, as I'll talk about, the conflict is already occurring with those countries. And so that has really animated a lot, if not most, I think, of the national security thinking in Washington right now. We're currently spending, in the next budget, $14 billion a year through the federal budget on cybersecurity and cyber defense programs. That does not account for what we're spending for offensive programs and for intelligence programs, which are classified. So what I want to talk about in our time together today is how we got here, where we're seeing cyberspace as a domain for war and for intelligence operations, and ultimately what that means for national security policy and also for personal privacy, because these two issues are, I think, as you'll see, are embedded in the way that our government is approaching this. I go back and begin this whole evolution of how we got here to a moment that really begins in the Bush presidency. And in many ways, you can see this evolution of cyber warfare as a story about three presidents and how they've reacted to threats in cyberspace. And this first story is in May of 2007. So you're looking at the last quarter, really, of the George W. Bush administration. And the president decided to call a meeting of his top national security officials, primarily for the question of whether or not we could use intelligence operations and cyber warfare, as we would then call it, in the battle in Iraq. And there had been a whole presentation, which I'll talk about in a little bit here, that had been prepared for the president about offensive options that the United States had for dealing with what was then a major insurgency that was vexing U.S. forces and threatening the stability of Iraq. And there was a lot of time left over in this conversation. In fact, Director of National Intelligence Mike McConnell was the man who had kind of convened everybody to get together for this, and very quickly got the president's sign-off to do some new and interesting things in Iraq. And he had about 45 minutes left in what was supposed to be an hour-long conversation with the president about this issue. And he decided to take the opportunity to bring something up with President Bush that had been worrying him a great deal for many years. Mike McConnell, who was then sort of the top intelligence official in the government, had actually back in the mid-1990s been the director of the National Security Agency, which of course is the agency that goes out and collects communications and signals of our adversaries, but also tries to pay attention to cyber threats that are coming into the United States. And McConnell had spent much of the past 10 years really believing that the internet posed a strategic risk to the United States and trying to find a way to break through to national leaders about this. And he sensed this particular moment with President Bush where he said, you know, I want to talk to you about the vulnerability that exists in cyberspace right now. And in knowing that the president was not a great technologist himself, I mean, President Bush, not to pick on him, but once said that he liked to look at photos of his ranch in Texas on the Google. And this was sort of how he interacted with the internet. So he wasn't really a technological thinker, but he did think in terms of strategy and particularly in terms of life in America since the 9/11 attacks. And Mike McConnell knew that and said, well, Mr. President, let me talk to you about the strategic vulnerability that exists today. If on 9/11, instead of hijackers flying planes into buildings, you had had hackers accessing the database of a major financial organization or an institution, let's say the stock market, or a major bank that clears global financial transactions. And if they had gotten into that data and corrupted it in such a way, just by changing numbers or even taking down access to it, that financial transactions couldn't clear or people were no longer clear what the actual value of a stock was, you would have seen an economic panic set off by that would have rivaled any kind of economic consequences that we had from the physical attacks of 9/11, which of course triggered a minor recession in this country. And Bush was quite incredulous about this. He was not quite grasping exactly how it was that people sitting at a computer could cause this real world economic damage, but it was dawning on him that this could be a problem. So he turned to his Treasury Secretary, who was out in the room at the time, to kind of gut check Mike McConnell on this. And of course, Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, had run Goldman Sachs. That was his previous job. And he turned to Paulson and he said, Hank, is what Mike here is telling me true? And Paulson sort of pauses and looks at the president and says, Mr. President, not only is what he's saying accurate, but when I ran Goldman Sachs, this was the scenario that kept us all up at night because we had no way to defend against it and we weren't sure how we would ever recover if it happened. And so this kind of moment for the president, it struck him what a vulnerability this is. And as people who were in the room for this conversation described it to me, he kind of stands back from the desk and stands up in the room and says, the internet is our strategic vulnerability, but also our strategic asset. I'll do whatever it takes to protect it. I'll launch another Manhattan Project if that's what I have to do. So he's equating it in the terms of the quest to build the atomic bomb. And he looks at Mike McConnell and he says, Mike, you brought this problem in here. You've got 30 days to fix it. So you can be careful what you ask for with time with the president. I mean, needless to say, Mike McConnell and the intelligence community did not fix the internet in 30 days. But what began in that moment was for the first time the commander-in-chief had actually conceived of cyberspace as a place that posed strategic vulnerability but was also a strategic asset, and that it needed to be protected with some kind of national force in the push of a whole of government. And out of this began an initiative to do exactly that. And the forefront of it really involved using our intelligence assets to go out and take the information that we were collecting about foreign threats and about threats that were coming into the United States in terms of hacking against corporations, theft of personal information, and to try and harness that and push that out to companies and to internet service providers. 85% of the networks in this country are actually privately owned. So when we talk about cyberspace, we're not actually talking about an area that the government controls or owns, and certainly not one that they regulate. We're talking about private industry and those systems that it owns. And what Bush wanted to start doing was taking the benefit of American intelligence and sharing that with private industry, which on the one hand sounds like kind of like a no-brainer, but that is an arrangement unlike anything that we have ever seen from a national security perspective in the United States, where the fruits of espionage, essentially the NSA and other organizations looking out and seeing these threats coming at us, being shared with private industry, and then the government saying, now you have to go out and try and protect these networks, which, yes, you own privately, but also are a strategic national asset for us. That's an entirely new dynamic, and it really began when President Bush realized that there was something that he had to do as commander-in-chief to start kind of mobilizing the government around it. So as we move forward into the campaign in 2008, another warning shot gets fired. It's a reminder of how important this actually is. Both the Obama and the McCain campaigns were briefed by law enforcement and intelligence agencies that hackers, believed to be probably in China, were trying to access their campaign email systems and their websites. Now, the belief behind this was that they were trying to steal the information to get a leg up on what the policies in an Obama administration or a McCain administration might look like. But nevertheless, this was a foreign government trying to penetrate a political campaign, and the decision was made to start briefing people in the campaign about that. So when President Obama comes into office, not only is he already pretty internet savvy himself, right? I mean, this is somebody who ran a grassroots campaign that was organized on the internet, but he already had a briefing from law enforcement saying, look, you need to understand that you're a target. And these are state adversaries that are aligned against the political system. So I think he came in with kind of an appreciation that certainly at a strategic level, President Bush had kind of gotten the ball rolling, and Obama is prepared to pick it up and to move with that. And he didn't waste a lot of time. It was interesting. In May of 2009, he gave a speech from the East Room where he announced his own initiative to continue the work that President Bush was doing and kind of mobilize the whole of government effort. And he did something really extraordinary. For the first time, he declassified information that showed that power grids in the United States had actually been targeted by foreign hackers. And what we're talking about here is individuals getting into the computers that control and regulate the electrical system and how those systems work. These are called industrial control systems. And it had been kind of talked about in the intelligence community and whispered about that hackers had accessed some of these systems, but no president had ever come out and talked about that, and he did. And I remember being in the room, and for those of us who cover this, it was kind of like, wow, okay, we're in a different moment here now where the president is kind of pulling back the veil and trying to level with people about what the threats are, which was an extraordinary admission. And then kind of building on something that President Bush had realized, he said the vast majority of our critical information infrastructure in the United States is owned and operated by the private sector. We will collaborate with industry to find technology solutions that ensure our security and promote prosperity. I think that's such an interesting idea. He is saying essentially that we are going to develop a new national security strategy that depends on the government and private industry collaborating with each other. That had never happened before, like at least probably not since the Second World War, where there was a mass mobilization on the defense front. There was not a lot of talk about the privacy implications that were going to be involved in this, with now the government sort of trying to turn inward and look at our networks and understand what those threats were, how it was that we were going to protect companies from the liability of maybe not adequately defending if the power grid was under attack. But it was really kind of striking, and it was a moment that I thought really reflected that we were going to be talking about national security through a different kind of lens, through this kind of public-private partnership, which I call in my second book, At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. We talk a lot about the military-industrial complex, about private and public sector coming together, and that's essentially what was being proposed by the president and what much of his policy over the next 8 years rolled out towards. And he referred to the internet as a strategic national asset, he said, and we will protect it as such. Which I didn't know if he knew it, but only 2 years earlier, President Bush had said essentially the same thing in the Oval Office. So here you have two people with very different views about national security, but essentially looking at cyberspace through a very similar lens. So that's kind of been the defensive posture of the United States for the better part of the past 8 years, is that the government feels that it has an opportunity here to work with private industry, but also a responsibility to warn and to push out against these strategic threats. We do some things on the offensive side as well. We are not simply sitting in a defensive crouch, although the offensive side of this is a lot more protected and is more highly classified. But I'll talk about one story that I tell in my book that I think is pretty interesting and gives you a sense, too, of how we probably should have been clued in better to what Russia did in the elections in 2016. So I mentioned that Oval Office conversation that the president had with his national security advisors, and they wanted his authority to go out and conduct cyber operations against the insurgency in Iraq in 2007. It's interesting that they needed the president's authorization to do this. Cyber warfare is still seen as something that requires very high-level sign-off by the commander-in-chief, because you're going out and attacking networks that are used by everyday people to communicate. You're talking about conducting surveillance potentially on a broad scale on private networks. So they wanted the president's authority to launch a very ambitious plan, the result of which was that the United States military and the intelligence community essentially took over the entire telecommunications system of the country of Iraq and conducted 24/7 monitoring on that network to try and isolate and find the networks of extremists and bomb makers that were, of course, using that system to communicate with each other via text messages, via websites, via email. Unless we think that the United States lacks the capacity to actually go out and sit on an entire national network and monitor it, this program worked with lethal accuracy when it really came down to it. What we were able to do was monitor and track individuals and networks, and by their electronic communications, essentially find where they were living, and then go and arrest those people or neutralize them through other ways. This involved not just tracking them down to where they lived, but in some cases, getting in the middle of their communications and sending fake text messages to insurgents and bomb makers to trick them into showing up to a particular place in Iraq where they were then met by US forces. This is really cyber warfare translating into the physical realm, or what the military likes to call kinetic effect. And certainly insurgents felt that pretty powerfully. We didn't know this at the time that this was happening during the surge, but people who I interviewed extensively say it wasn't so much the addition of a number of additional thousands of troops that we sent to Iraq that made the difference in turning around the war, but it was this intelligence component. It was actually the cyber piece of it that allowed us to find where the enemy was and attack them very precisely. And David Petraeus later said that the combination of this cyber effort with ground forces, in his words, were, quote, the prime reason for the significant progress made by US troops in the surge in 2007 and 2008, and directly enabled the removal of almost 4,000 insurgents from the battlefield. So this is a very powerful example of how this kind of cyber espionage, but very directed kind of cyber warfare, can pay off in the real world. I mean, effectively, David Petraeus is saying here, without this, the surge doesn't work, and potentially Iraq would have plummeted into civil war. The US is not the only country that has figured out how to do this, clearly. And what we saw towards the beginning of the Bush administration and then throughout the Obama administration is we entered into this period of almost incessant attacks on the United States, whether from criminal groups or from nation states. I dare say probably nobody in this room has not received a notice from their bank or their credit card company about your personal information being exposed. You probably didn't feel the consequences of that very much, but you're certainly aware of how much this is ramped up as a kind of a threat in recent years. And then we've seen actual more targeted attacks coming from nation states as well. You'll remember in November of 2014, Sony Pictures Studio was hacked in an attack by North Korea, where the country came in retaliation for a movie, satirical film about Kim Jong-il, the departed dear leader, that the studio was about to release that they thought was offensive, and North Korea decided to basically wipe out all of Sony's computer systems in retaliation for that. Which, again, on its surface kind of sounds like more a disruption or a pain, but for a company the size of Sony, this was crippling. And here you had a nation state launching an attack on an American company. And again, the dilemma for the United States was, how do we get involved in this? Are we obligated to try and respond to this in some way? Probably so. Do we have an obligation to say publicly that it was North Korea and reveal the information that shows this? Yes, and the Obama administration did that, though very carefully and somewhat reluctantly. But then the question was, is there some kind of duty to protect from this? Did the intelligence community know ahead of time that Sony was at risk? How do we deal with situations when the government detects some kind of threat coming at a private interest? Do we step in and do we tell them you're at risk? The Obama administration never really figured that out. And as we'll see here in a little bit when it gets into the election, I think some of that was partly because there was a real trepidation on the part of the administration to, even though it recognized this is a new way of thinking about warfare, they still were not comfortable with forcefully pushing the government to the front of that. We saw increases in attacks in this period from Iran, which started launching crippling attacks on bank websites and started probing critical infrastructure in the United States, including a dam in upstate New York. And rampant cyber espionage by China, which stole and has stolen, I believe it's safe to say, hundreds of billions of dollars in intellectual property and trade secrets from American companies. The Chinese government has actually essentially institutionalized the large-scale theft of intellectual property from the United States in order to accelerate its own economy. This is really espionage as a state economic model. And something that has been deeply troubling for a number of administrations. And of course, all of the attacks on financial and retail organizations in the commercial sectors that we feel on a daily basis. But for all of this, by 2016, I think it was fair to say that the U.S. was facing an array of hostile adversaries, but there was some broad recognition throughout the government that there was a role for the government in this area, and that cyberspace was a new battlefield where we had to both fight for supremacy, but also recognize that we were extremely vulnerable. People were paying attention at the highest levels of government, and while the response was not perfect, and while a lot of these issues pose dilemmas, like with North Korea, when do we step in to try and stop something we know might be happening, people were paying attention and government was focused on this, which I think is what makes what happened next in the election of 2016 so, to me, incredibly baffling and upsetting. So throughout that summer in 2016, the U.S. intelligence community was beginning to detect signs that the Russian government aimed to interfere in the election. It wasn't immediately clear how that would play out, but information was pouring in from our allied intelligence services as well as our own sources in Russia, in some cases human sources, who were reporting that President Putin in Russia had ordered a covert operation to interfere with the 2016 election. In June 2016, my paper, The Washington Post, revealed that Russian hackers had broken into the Democratic National Committee and stolen emails, which were subsequently given to WikiLeaks and published prior to the Democratic Convention. We all know that story. What's interesting is that this was not the first time we had seen Russians pull off an operation like this. In fact, two of the hacker groups working for Russian intelligence that broke into the DNC, which went by the colorful names Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, you may remember those. Those are names that we gave them, they don't call themselves that, had actually broken into US government systems a few years before, including at the State Department when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and at the White House. And there had been reasons to believe that similar groups in Russian intelligence were involved in trying to penetrate systems going back into the Bush administration. So my point here is that this was not really new activity that we were seeing. But what we were seeing that was new was the weaponization of this information. The theft of emails traditionally and of proprietary government information was to inform the thinking of other governments about how they could get a leg up on us or how they could gain strategic advantage. Remember when Obama and McCain were warned in 2008? There was no anticipation that China was trying to steal those emails from McCain and Obama to publish them. They just wanted to know what the campaign was thinking. This now, though, was different, the actual weaponization of this. It also should not have been a surprise when you think about it, because in a similar way, this is not all that different from what we were doing in Iraq in 2007. Getting into people's private messages, sending them things that looked authentic, trying to strategically confuse or even trick our adversaries into taking actions that weren't to their benefit and that played into our hands. We saw this with the release of emails through WikiLeaks. We saw this with the Russian manipulation of social media, including Facebook and Twitter, with the use of automated bots. It's fascinating to me that our imagination in the US was able to capture what this might look like, but when it was actually happening around us, there wasn't the same kind of force to respond to it. I think it's fair to call that a system failure. And as somebody who has written so extensively about the ways that government officials sat around and worried about how cyberspace made us vulnerable and were prepared to do something to protect us, it's still not entirely clear to me why we didn't act. I've tried to come up with a couple of reasons for why that is. One is I think that the administration really genuinely did have a concern about announcing prior to an election that the Russian government was interfering for fear that they would be accused of weighing in on the side of Hillary Clinton. You're trying to say that, these messages that we're seeing that might be in favor of one candidate and opposed to another are somehow the work of a foreign adversary? That would raise questions of political bias. That would raise questions of interference in an election. It could potentially raise questions of privacy. I mean, are we suddenly now saying that the government has a role in monitoring our Facebook posts to try and figure out what content skews to the left versus what's to the right, and what they think is fake and what they think is real? So you can imagine, a White House not wanting to wade into that conversation. The second reason, I think, is that, of course, the Obama administration thought Hillary Clinton would be elected. So I think that they believed that intervening was at too great of a cost for all of the negative repercussions. And at any rate, probably Hillary Clinton, who was obviously the candidate that Putin didn't favor, was going to win, and she'll come up with a response. In fact, one of the reasons, and I reported on this at the time, that the administration did not come up with more of a set of operational responses, shall we say, to strike back at the Russians was because they assumed that Hillary Clinton would take care of it when she became president. That didn't play out so well. I think it's fair to say that nobody in the US government had also really considered the other dimension of this information operation by Russia, which was that a candidate for office and an American citizen would arguably enable and encourage these attacks, or at least not stand up to them. My mind goes in specifically to one moment in July 27th in 2016 when Donald Trump was campaigning in Florida, and the initial batch of WikiLeaks emails had already been posted, which of course showed that within the DNC there was a real bias against Bernie Sanders and in favor of Hillary Clinton, which I think was not necessarily a surprise to people in Washington, but nevertheless was hugely disruptive within the Democratic Party, where they felt that Bernie Sanders and opponents to Clinton were not being given a fair shake. So this information was out there, it was hugely disruptive, and candidate Trump, rather than doing what I think probably most people expected a candidate for office would do, which would be to condemn this and say this looks like the Russians are trying to interfere, seemed to capitalize on it. And he said on July 27th, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you can find Hillary Clinton's missing 30,000 emails. And I think you'll be mightily rewarded by our press. These were emails that had been contained on her private server that she said that she had deleted because they involved private information and stuff about her family. And there was a strain of thought among her political opponents that that couldn't have happened and that those emails probably are out there someplace. Either she's hiding them or they were obtained by hackers. That's an extraordinary thing, though, when a candidate for office essentially stands up and encourages a foreign government to attack his political opponent. And I don't know that we really reckoned with that at the time. I know that we in the press, I think, did not fully reckon with that at the time. And I think we bear some amount of blame for constantly writing about the content of the emails that had been released rather than actually writing about who was releasing them and why. It took a while, and I think too long, many people would argue, for the administration to act on Russia's intervention in the election, but ultimately it did. On October 7th, 2016, there was an extraordinary joint statement that was released by the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Homeland Security, which confirmed what many reporters already knew and people had been reporting anonymously, that Russia was behind the hacks and also had been probing state election systems. Of the email hacks, the statement said, quote, such activity is not new to Moscow. The Russians have used similar tactics and techniques across Europe and Asia, for example, to influence public opinion there. We believe, based on the scope and sensitivity of these efforts in the United States, that only Russia's senior-most officials could have authorized these activities. So that's a pretty extraordinary thing. They're saying that the Russian government ordered this directly. Oh, by the way, we've seen this happen somewhere before, which kind of leads to the question of, well, maybe you should have said something about it earlier. But that was an amazing thing to see. You would be forgiven if you don't remember that statement or the day that it came out, because a few hours later, a tape was revealed from an appearance that Donald Trump made on the Access Hollywood TV show a few years earlier, where he was heard talking about bragging about grabbing women. So that was the day of the Access Hollywood tape. And a few hours after that, WikiLeaks began releasing emails that had been hacked from John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman. So here we are again with this moment to try and educate the American people about a real thing that's happening to them. And it was completely overtaken by the news cycle. I remember that day very well. It's become more the norm that you get 2 or 3 major stories happening at once in this administration, but that was really the first taste of it. These 3 major stories all happened on one day. The intelligence community did later conclude more publicly and with more detail that Russia intervened in the election. It came out and said that there were 2 goals. One was that they kind of simultaneously were trying to undermine the Clinton campaign, because the Russians also, by the way, thought Hillary Clinton was going to get elected. This wasn't just the White House thinking that. And where they could, trying to boost Donald Trump's chances, although I think subsequent reporting has shown that they never really thought he was going to win. And second, the conclusion was that the Russians did this to, quote, undermine the US-led liberal democratic order, which is such an ambitious idea that it almost boggles the mind that a country would set out through email hacking and manipulation of social media to engage in something so broad and so vast. But that is the conclusion of our 17 intelligence agencies. And when I read that statement, I am reminded by how many years they have been thinking about this and the way that cyberspace, again, can create these kind of strategic national and political vulnerabilities. And I like this example because we all lived through it with Russia, right? And we've seen what this kind of infiltration did to our already polarized and divisive politics. This was a cyber attack. I think that is the right way to think about it. So when we're talking about cyberspace as a battlefield, this is really a concrete example of what that looks like. And we knew we could anticipate things like this, and we didn't respond, I think, forcefully enough to it. So I think it's fair to criticize the Obama administration. I think it's also fair to criticize the Trump campaign, and now an administration that really hasn't, I think, forcefully responded to it. I think it's not the best place for us to be as a country. We've had ample opportunity to think about this problem, and I don't know that it's ever been sufficiently addressed. But what I do feel is different now is that President Trump, unlike his Democratic and Republican predecessors, hasn't really embraced the strategic dimensions of cyberspace and really come to reckon with this fifth domain of warfare and the ways that it makes us vulnerable. There is no comparable whole-of-government effort as there was with Bush and Obama, despite their weaknesses, to actually respond to this and to shore up the nation's defenses, not just against Russian political intervention, but against a variety of other kinds of threats. And it's kind of shocking in some ways that it hasn't been. If you think about the Russian intervention as the sort of cyber equivalent of a 9/11, an adversary identified a weakness in our system, in this case politically polarized groups of people, exploited it to great effect, possibly even greater effect than they could have imagined. After 9/11, we basically reoriented the entire national security apparatus. We created new departments and new agencies. We held hearings. We had multiple commissions. It just sort of changed everything. And there was no comparable whole-of-government response to the Russian intervention, despite having years of understanding within our government about the ways that we are vulnerable in cyberspace, despite having good policies and programs that we're trying to get running. Nobody really took the reins and said, okay, now is the time where we really have to reorient and shore up our defenses. I do think the president doesn't undertake this necessary work because I think he believes that acknowledging that Russia tried to help him get elected would somehow undermine the legitimacy of his campaign, and that's not something that he can do. It's certainly not the case that his advisors and the people around him don't understand the severity of the threat. So there's also other debates that we're not having because the president doesn't grapple with the strategic nature of cyberspace. We have had in the past 10 years an entire apparatus grow up between the intelligence community and the military and private industry where they are trying more and more to work hand in glove to monitor private networks, to monitor networks that we all use. Which is not to say that a rampant, out-of-control surveillance state has been unleashed on us, but the fact of the matter is that the laws and restrictions that govern surveillance in this country are changing. Supreme Court rulings recently have now made it so it's easier for government and law enforcement agencies to get access to information and data that previously they would have needed a warrant to obtain. That is changing the nature of how we think about the Fourth Amendment in this country, how we use digital communications. And again, we're not really having a conversation about that. And sometimes it feels that that's because the moment we want to talk about things like foreign hacking, we start getting back into replaying the 2016 election. There is some kind of paralysis right now, I think, that we're not getting past, and it's distracting us from having broader conversations about this. This is the wrong frame for a vital discussion that we need to have and haven't had sufficiently in the country. We've built a massive surveillance system that touches on all our lives and our common daily infrastructure in the internet, and we just haven't really sat down and grappled with the pros and the cons of doing that. But we are dealing with the consequences of avoiding that right now. I don't want to leave you on an entirely pessimistic note. There are real things that are happening in the government that just because you haven't seen the kind of executive top-down level buy-in by the president as you did with Bush and Obama, that we are responding to and dealing with new threats in a new way. One of the things that President Trump has done that I think many people in the military and the intelligence community would argue was long overdue is that he's actually granted more authority to conduct cyber offense in ways that don't require the president to sign off on it. So we have seen more of the decision-making to go out and conduct the kinds of operations that took place in Iraq in 2007, pushing that a little bit further down the chain of command so that military commanders can start dealing with cyber weapons, if you will, the way they do conventional weapons. And so where every strike is not something that has to be granted from the highest authority. We've actually tried some of this with regards to combating ISIS, and you are seeing more kinds of these cyber attacks going on. There was a little notice, I think, well, maybe not a little notice, but a story in the New York Times last week, actually, that elements of the intelligence community have been sending emails to suspected Russian hackers who they think might be trying to interfere with the upcoming midterm elections. That's an interesting change. That's a little bit of more pushing forward, and that kind of decision-making authority is being granted to lower levels in the system, which might be a good thing. There's also a whole new push across the intelligence community to start thinking about the grand strategic threats posed by Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Gina Haspel, who is the new director of the CIA, gave a speech about a month ago in Louisville, Kentucky, where she said essentially counterterrorism, which is what the intelligence community has been focused on since 9/11, will continue to be something that they're focused on, and the attendant issues with that. But that we've spent 17 years basically fighting al-Qaeda and then ISIS and have been taking our eyes off the ball of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And she envisions getting back to great power strategy and big, hard intelligence targets, which is kind of where the intelligence community has always been. And cyberspace will be a major component of that. The agency just went through a big reorganization, and there's a whole new division devoted to science and technology in cyber operations. So that will tell you that the CIA for sure sees this, as well as the military does, as a new domain of warfare. But I still think that on the whole, the government and the president in particular haven't grappled with the real security realities of the fifth domain of warfare and a new era of espionage and warfare. I still believe that we have the intellectual capacity to do that, but I worry that our political capacity to tackle big problems like this one is at a low point, and that there may not be, frankly, enough juice left in the system to address this problem. And so at this moment, I'm sad to say that as a nation, I think that we are quite vulnerable and unprepared for a cyber attack. Our leaders aren't responding to this in a fashion that arguably they should. So we're a week out of the midterms. If you think that this is an issue of vital national importance, your leaders are listening, and now is an opportunity to tell them that. But I hope that we will all get a lot smarter on this and come to realize both the real asset that cyberspace has created for us, but the ways that we really need to get smart and start thinking about the ways that it has made us vulnerable and how we need to prepare for that. So with that, I'll be glad to take your questions. Thank you. Yeah.
So you make a plausible argument, I think, that because of the way the 2016 elections unfolded in the aftermath, the president is hesitant to discuss the Russian hacking issues to the degree that he would like. Makes sense, but it seems to me that there is a broader problem that stems from that episode. It isn't just about the president saying that. And distinguish between the sort of Facebook fake news kind of scheme or whatever it was versus hacking the Clinton emails or the DNC emails. The scheme, frankly, strikes most people as kind of silly. Like, if the notion that running some fake Facebook ads to tip the election is implausible on its face, and frankly pretty unlikely that it made any difference, though some people are claiming otherwise for their own political reasons. So even separate from President Trump, others see that particular episode as not necessarily fake news. They recognize the Russians likely did this scheme, but would think that if it was a serious attack on America, it was a pathetic serious attack on America. Right. So in a sense, it's not very scary, so why worry about it very much?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. And I think, and a lot of that, and probably a lot of people have the same feeling that this was so, as you said, implausible and kind of nuts, and that why should we get too worked up about it? And I think that's probably, there's a fair argument in that. Like, you have to always ask yourself, especially in the middle of an election, is it worth the administration weighing in and telling people this if we really think the threat's not that great? I guess what I would say, though, is at the time, the Obama administration certainly felt it was great. And so separate from the question of whether politically it was a necessity or not, I think that by their own standards, they failed. And so far as the intelligence community was warning the White House about this, they felt that this intervention could be corrosive. It could undermine confidence in the election. And even if only for a small number of people, is that something that we want to avoid? But I think what's also troubling to a lot of people in the community, and troubles me too, is that there's a resistance to even acknowledge that it happened by the president at this point. And even if it was something that didn't tip the election, and I think most people will tell you that you can't actually ever know if it tipped the election or not, why is there such resistance to acknowledging that it happened and preparing for that? Again, because who's to say that next time it won't be a more sophisticated intervention, such as by actually hacking into voting machines or trying to manipulate vote counts or eliminate voter rolls to cause chaos at polling places, which was something that looked like the Russians might have been about to do but didn't in 2016.
They have done in other countries.
Absolutely.
Because other countries have much lower barriers.
Yeah.
Or had
Right.
lower barriers to this. So, as you say, it's fair to observe the Russians have a long history of effectually screwing up people's elections.
Right.
It's not clear that happened in our case.
In this particular instance, right. I saw your hand up too, ma'am. Go ahead.
You mentioned the power grid earlier.
Yeah.
Have we made significant progress against an EMP strike?
About an EMP strike, I don't know. And this is something that actually comes up a lot in relation to the cyber question. So EMP is essentially the idea that you would use a device to trigger what's called an electromagnetic pulse that would kind of shock the system and shut it down. I can't speak to that specifically. What I can say is that energy companies in general have not solved the recovery problem for whether the grid is taken down by, or a portion of the grid, by an EMP attack or by a cyber attack, which is to say that if there was some kind of massive attack that disabled generators in large industrial systems, most, I think, regulators will tell you they don't have that backup equipment sitting in a warehouse someplace. It could take several months to bring that back online. So there, too, is an area where, if we're going to talk about having national resiliency to a cyber attack or an EMP, we got to talk about how do you actually recover if it does happen, in addition to what's the government's role in trying to intervene before that happens. Yeah.
Full disclosure, I'm a retired military officer. You're with the Washington Post. We don't have a deep abiding affection for that journal.
I have a deep abiding affection for the military, but go ahead.
You touched upon politicization of this briefly, and you're focused mainly on external threats.
Yeah.
For many of us, I think, the internal cyber threats, and I would highlight just for a few, the failure to address Hillary Clinton's private server and all the clear violations of security issued there. Congressman Wasserman Schultz buffoonery in her IT shop and the failure to address that. And thirdly, the potential use of the Pfizer courts to allow cyber monitoring and cyber activity within the United States. I think for a lot of us, the concern with regard to cyber warfare and cyber security is not just looking at all those external threats that you're talking about, but very much looking at the internal threats as well. And I think perhaps that's one of the things that constrains President Trump from being willing to address this issue, because he doesn't know how much of the intelligence and cyber community within the United States he can trust.
Yeah.
If you'd address that.
I think it's a great question, and it is the case that the president has been deeply skeptical of the intelligence community, and quite publicly so. And we go back to the campaign where he accused the administration of wiretapping him in Trump Tower. Now, there's no evidence that happened, and I could talk at length about why I think that's highly implausible. Nevertheless, I think what he is speaking to is a deep anxiety that millions of Americans have about the full extent and the capabilities of the government when it comes to this area of monitoring private individuals. I think that most Americans would probably be surprised to learn that agencies like the National Security Agency and the FBI have extremely strict internal compliance requirements. Probably most people will believe that's not true. I think it is. I've reported on it for a long time. But that system can break down in an instant when somebody decides to do the wrong thing. And I'll give you a very concrete example of this. During the transition from President Obama to President Trump, you'll remember that a number of news organizations, including ones that I worked at, and my name was on one of these stories, reported that General Flynn, Michael Flynn, who was the designated national security advisor, had conversations with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, during the transition. And then it later came out what they had talked about. Well, why did reporters know that? They knew that for the following reason. The National Security Agency, as a matter of routine, monitors the communications of the Russian ambassador to the United States. It picked up communications, in this case, we believe a cell phone conversation between Sergei Kislyak and Michael Flynn. That information went into a report and effectively into a transcript, which is then seen by people in the intelligence community. Under the law, Michael Flynn's name cannot appear in that document. It appears as like U.S. person number 1. It's anonymized. That is done to protect the privacy and civil liberties of Michael Flynn, who has a right to talk to the Russian ambassador if he wants to talk to him, whenever he wants to talk to him. Putting aside, the questions of policy and what they discussed, as a primary matter, you get to talk to whoever you want to in this country. And if the person you're talking to is under surveillance, there are protections in place to make sure that your name doesn't get put in that report and then put around government. Well, at some point, somebody in the government decided they needed to understand who this person was that was talking to the Russian ambassador. I think there's a perfectly legitimate national security reason for that. And the process went through to unmask that name. Lawyers have to oversee that. That's now being investigated by Congress. But then somebody decided to tell reporters about that conversation. Now, whether you agree that Michael Flynn should have been talking to the Russian ambassador or not, whether you voted for the president or not, objectively, Michael Flynn's privacy and civil liberties were violated in that moment. And that was a crime. And so I think that when we talk about surveillance, we can talk about it on this big level that has lots of controls and it's quite intimidating and powerful, and there are internal compliance mechanisms. But the one minute that somebody decides to not abide by them, that's when the whole system breaks. And in this case, maybe it was somebody who didn't like President Trump. But what's to say that in 2 years from now, somebody who likes President Trump but doesn't like his opponent will start leaking those conversations? If we're in the era now where we are weaponizing intelligence for political purposes, we are in a very, very dark period. And I think we probably are there. And we should all be aware of that, regardless of who you voted for. Sir.
One thing to touch on is when you start in the beginning about a private partnership with the government to get our handles around this, I thought about the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
And I thought at that time the best of the brightest were the government. Well, today, it ain't the case.
Yeah.
You've got Amazon, you've got probably the best and brightest in private industry. And I'm wondering, will they be forthcoming in working with government to protect themselves when it may not be in their best interest when they compete with one another?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. First of all, how do you bring them to the table? How do you, as a company that has a responsibility to protect your customers' data, trust that the government's going to be protective of it too if you start sharing information with them about the threats that are coming at you? And for a lot of companies who don't like to participate with the government, they say it's because it's a one-way street. The government comes and says, well, tell us what you're seeing on your networks, but then they don't tell them what they're seeing coming at them. And this is a real problem. There's also, there's a philosophical divide. A lot of the companies in Silicon Valley have a real libertarian, kind of techno-libertarian ethos that doesn't lend itself to wanting to cooperate with big government and with surveillance. There's a trust barrier that broke down, frankly, after the Snowden leaks. When a lot of companies felt that the government wasn't telling them the full extent of what they'd been doing to try and break encryption and penetrate networks and capture communications overseas as they moved to a domestic channel, and felt really kind of betrayed, frankly, by that. So getting those two sides to sit down together, it has been a challenge for many, many years. And of course, much of the talent goes to the private sector and not into government. That's a huge dilemma that I don't know how you fix. But that has to be solved because, if you're really going to see cybersecurity in the Manhattan Project lens, like President Bush did, and I think both Obama and Bush saw this as something where both sides are going to have to work together, they're going to have to figure out how to trust one another. And that's just been a very hard hill for them both to climb.
Last question is going to go to Bruce.
I was fascinated watching the Mark Levin show a couple weeks ago about this interview, this gentleman named George Gilder talking about the cryptocosm as being kind of a defense mechanism that can't be penetrated in the future. Or do you know any? Can you?
Well, I don't know about that particular, but I can talk about encryption and sort of the way that this has become.
Blockchain as a stable mechanism for preventing lots of what would otherwise be not just currency devaluation, but all sorts of other things. That blockchain is an answer.
Right, right. And I think, well, I don't study blockchain closely. I know it's also going to become like the answer to everything, sort of is the joke of it. But, if maybe like encryption is a way that I can speak to that. There has been a massive push on the crypto or the encryption side probably in the last 3 years to protect private communications and to protect data. And what's been really interesting is the way that that has been pushed down to the level of individual apps that anybody in this room could use. So 3 years ago, if you wanted to encrypt your email, you had to go download what's called a PGP key, which is like a long string of numbers and digits, and you had to get a special email program to basically make it so when you sent email to another recipient and you both had the keys to encrypt and decrypt, you could do that. But it was quite cumbersome. Now, I have probably, let me just pull up my folder here. There's 9 different apps that have encryption that I have on this phone. Text, email, and voice. And the way that these companies have set up the systems are that even if the government knew who I was talking to and they went to the company that runs the app and said, show us the content of the conversation or give us the text of the email, they would say, we can't because we literally don't possess the decryption key. It's generated and we don't have it. So on the one hand, this has been a tremendous boon if you look at it from the standpoint of personal privacy. Like you can genuinely encrypt your conversations right now. This makes the government absolutely crazy. And Jim Comey, when he was the FBI director under President Obama, he had this whole speech that he would give about the threat of going dark, that the FBI was no longer going to be able to get the communications of potential criminals. How would they be able to track kidnapping victims? How would they be able to combat child pornography if everything was encrypted and if encryption was essentially shielded from, the decryption was impossible for the government. That's kind of the world we're living in now, frankly, where the level of encryption has gone down to the consumer level, and you actually have that capability now. The government does not have an answer for that, by the way. The NSA is very good at cracking codes and decrypting things, and for state adversaries will invest billions of dollars into quantum computing and other things that are geared towards state adversaries. But when it comes down to the individual level and encrypting your communications, we as consumers have quite a decided advantage, I think, probably over the government there. Yeah. Thank you all very much.